The call connected on the second ring. That was the detail Matteo would repeat to anyone who asked, in the weeks and months that followed, with the certainty of a 7-year-old who had witnessed a miracle and needed everyone to understand its exact dimensions. Not the third ring, not voicemail. The second ring. As if the universe had been holding its breath, waiting for a small boy to press the wrong name in his mother's contacts and change the entire shape of their lives. But I am getting ahead of myself. I have to go back to the morning it started, when the most catastrophic thing that had ever happened to me was also, in the precise way of catastrophic things, the door I had been too exhausted to find on my own. My name is Sable Voss. I was 29 years old, an omega, a mother to one imperious small person, and a contract bookkeeper for 3 restaurants, 2 dry cleaners, and a periodontist's office that always smelled of antiseptic and broken promises. I made rent. Barely. I made Matteo's school lunches every morning at $5.50 because the school's hot lunch program cost $4 per day, and $4 per day was $20 per week, and $20 per week was the electric bill in January. I had been doing this math for 3 years, since Matteo's father decided that an omega with a designation suppressor prescription and a shared lease was not, after all, what he wanted from his life. He had left a note. The note said he needed someone who could be fully present. I had taped it to the inside of the kitchen cabinet where I kept the good cups so that I could look at it every morning and remember exactly what I was working with. What I was working with on the morning of the call was a 7-hour overnight data entry job that had run long, a kitchen that smelled of coffee grounds, and the particular despair of 6 a.m. and a soft and widening darkness that arrived behind my eyes like a tide and did not announce itself before taking me down. I remember the floor. The specific geometry of the linoleum seam under my cheek, a line that had been lifting at the corner for 18 months and that I kept meaning to fix. I remember the sound Matteo made, which was not a scream but something worse. A held, precise silence, and then the sound of small feet landing very deliberately, one after the other, on the floor. And then I did not remember anything for a while. Matteo was 7. He was, as his kindergarten teacher had once put it in a note sent home that I still kept in my wallet, extremely self-possessed for his age. He had watched his mother iron the same 3 work blouses in rotation his entire life. He had learned to make his own breakfast because mornings were complicated. He understood at 7 that the word complicated was a container for a number of other words that adults preferred not to say in front of children, and he had the grace not to ask what those words were. He knew, because I had told him, that if something happened to Mom, he was to call the emergency number written in black marker on the inside cover of the blue folder in the kitchen drawer. The blue folder contained my proof of insurance, our building's emergency contacts, a laminated card with the pediatrician's number, and one folded paper on which I had written, in handwriting that was slightly too careful, the name Rowan. Rowan was my sister's college roommate. She was 34, a beta, and she had once, at a backyard party 3 years ago, pressed her number into my hand and said, in the direct and unceremonious way she had of saying things, "If anything ever happens to you, I mean anything, you call me." I had put her number in my phone under Rowan E. and in the folder under the heading Emergency Contact Non-Medical, and I had never called it because I had never needed to, because I had spent 3 years making absolutely sure I never needed to. Matteo found the blue folder. He opened it. He read the name. Then he went to my phone, which was on the coffee table at a child height he could reach, and he scrolled through the contacts, looking for Rowan. What he found before Rowan was a name entered under R. The name was Riven. Riven Ashcroft was not my sister's college roommate. Riven Ashcroft was not anyone I knew personally. Riven Ashcroft was the name I had saved in my contacts 11 months ago when a client of mine, a restaurant owner named Giorgio Plath, had handed me a business card and said, "She's the one who keeps my books honest. You should have her number in case I'm ever unavailable." Riven Ashcroft was the CEO of Ashcroft Capital Group, which owned or controlled, depending on whom you asked, between 40 and 60% of the commercial real estate in the city's financial district. She was an alpha. She was 38. She gave exactly 2 interviews per year, in both of which she said almost nothing, and the financial press printed them anyway, because they had no choice. The financial press called her the Iron Meridian. Matteo pressed call. He waited. She picked up on the second ring. I did not know any of this was happening. I was on the kitchen floor with my cheek against the seam in the linoleum, and Matteo was in the living room, holding my phone with both hands the way he held important things, and he was saying, in his careful, self-possessed voice, that his mom had fallen down and was sleeping on the floor and he couldn't wake her up, and could she please come? And on the other end of the line, in an office on the 27th floor of a glass tower I had walked past 100 times without ever going inside, a woman said, "What is your address?" Not "I'm sorry, this is a wrong number." Not "I'm calling emergency services for you now. Goodbye, what is your address?" Matteo told her. He knew our address by heart because I had made him memorize it when he was 4, standing in the kitchen with a wooden spoon in my hand and a very serious expression, telling him that an address was like a key to finding home. Riven Ashcroft was there in 11 minutes. I know the 11 minutes because Matteo, who had sat beside my feet and held my hand with the specific, fierce gentleness of a child who has decided that love requires action, had watched the clock on the microwave. He reported this information to me later, twice, with the air of a scientist presenting findings. I came back to consciousness to the sound of a door I had not buzzed open, and a voice that was calm and low and carried itself the way that certain voices do, the ones that have learned somewhere along the way that volume is not the measure of authority. The voice was saying Matteo's name, not asking it, saying it the way you say a name you already know. I heard my son say, "She's in the kitchen." I tried to sit up. Something said, "Don't." I opened my eyes. The woman crouching at the edge of my kitchen was very tall, even folded down like that, and she had the kind of stillness that costs more than movement. The stillness that comes from having trained yourself not to reveal anything you don't choose to reveal. Her hair was black and cut close. Her eyes were the particular gray of stormwater, not cold exactly, but clarified, as if weather had passed through them and burned off everything unessential. She smelled of dark fur and cold iron, a signature so clean, and decided that my designation systems registered it before I had finished forming the thought. She said, "Can you tell me where you hurt?" I said, I don't know who you are." She said, "No, can you tell me where you hurt?" It was not a deflection, it was a prioritization. I recognized it, distantly, as the reasoning of someone who had decided that the order of information mattered, and that my question could wait its turn. I said, "I'm fine." She looked at me for 3 seconds. The look was not unkind. It was simply accurate. She said, "You were unconscious on the floor. That is not a fine situation." Behind her, Matteo appeared in the kitchen doorway with the gravity of a small person who has managed a crisis and would like this to be acknowledged. He said, "I called you." She said, "I know. You did exactly right." His face did something then that I had not seen it do in a long time, a particular unclenching, the expression a child's face makes when a responsible adult has confirmed that the child's judgment was sound. It broke something in my chest that I had not known was braced. I said, "I don't. I think I have the wrong number saved." She said, "It appears so." Neither of us moved. I was still on the floor. She was still crouched at the edge of my kitchen, and the morning light was doing something to the line of her jaw that I did not have the physical resources to think about. She said, "There's an urgent care clinic 6 blocks east. I'm going to take you." I said, "I have work." She said, "You have a son, and you were unconscious on your kitchen floor." "The work will wait," I said, with considerable dignity. "Given my position on the linoleum, you don't actually have any say in what I do. You're a wrong number." Mateo said, from the doorway, in his carrying, impartial voice, "Mom, she came 11 minutes. That's very fast for someone who doesn't know us." Riven Ashcroft did not smile. But something in the air around her rearranged itself, very slightly, like a room where someone has shifted one piece of furniture and changed the whole geometry. She said, "The car's outside." I had not eaten in 19 hours. I had been awake for 21. The doctor at the urgent care clinic, a brisk beta woman who smelled of chamomile hand cream and mild impatience, told me that I had fainted from a combination of low blood sugar and exhaustion that she listed with the specificity of an indictment: dehydration, insufficient caloric intake for a nursing designation, and what she described very carefully as a suppressor schedule that was not calibrated to my current workload. She told me these things while Riven Ashcroft stood in the corner of the examination room and said nothing, and Mateo sat on the plastic chair beside the door, eating the crackers the nurse had brought him, with the focused pleasure of a person for whom crackers represent an unusual luxury. I said, "How did you?" I said, "Who let you into our building?" She said, "The super was in the lobby." I said, "You told him you were." She said, "I told him you'd called me." That was true. The doctor gave me a look, the particular look that medical professionals develop for situations that are clearly more complicated than they appear, and handed me a pamphlet. The pamphlet was titled Omega Wellness and Sustainable Energy Management, and had a photograph on the cover of a woman sitting in a sunny garden with a bowl of soup, looking tremendously rested. I had never in my life looked like the woman in that photograph. I was fairly confident no real person had. Riven Ashcroft drove us home. She drove the kind of car that does not announce what it costs because it does not need to. The silence of the engine did it, and the way the door closed, a sound like a decision made completely. Mateo, in the back seat, had apparently decided that certain social constraints did not apply to a person who had correctly managed a household emergency. Because he said, "Are you the kind of rich where you have a driver, or the kind of rich where you drive yourself?" There was a pause. She said, "I prefer to drive." He considered this. He said, "My mom says that's the more competent kind." I said, "Mateo." She said, "She's right." I watched the city go past the window and tried to understand what was happening. The Iron Meridian, whom I had never met, whose business card I had saved in my phone under the wrong index letter for 11 months and never once dialed, had come to my apartment in 11 minutes because my son had pressed the wrong name. She had taken me to a doctor. She had paid over my objection, without discussion, by handing the receptionist a card before I had finished retrieving my wallet. She was now driving us home. I said, "You don't have to do this." She said, "I'm aware." I said, "I mean, this is extremely out of your way." She said, "I was between meetings." I said, "It's 6:40 in the morning." She said, I keep early hours. Mateo said, me too. 5:50 for lunch preparation. Mom taught me. Riven Ashcroft looked at him in the rearview mirror. The look lasted 1 second and said nothing I could parse, and also, somehow, said everything. She walked us to the door of our apartment. She stood in the hallway while I turned the key, and Mateo went inside and immediately began the serious business of distributing his emergency cracker wrappers in the recycling with the care of a person who has been told twice about waste management. I said, "Thank you. I mean it." "I'm sorry he called you." She said, "I'm not." I looked at her. She held my gaze for 5 seconds, which is a long time to hold a gaze in a narrow hallway at 7:15 in the morning when you are a wrong number and have no particular obligation to be there. Then she said, "Eat something before noon." The doctor's instructions, not mine. I said, "Noted," she said, "and sleep." I said, "I have," she said. "Sleep. The work will still be wrong tomorrow if you don't rest first." It was the strangest thing anyone had said to me in 3 years, not because it was untrue, because it assumed, without any apparent effort, that my rest mattered to the outcome of things, that I was a variable whose condition affected the quality of everything downstream, that I was, in some accounting I had stopped performing on my own behalf, worth the resource of 8 hours. I stood in the doorway of my apartment and watched Riven Ashcroft walk back down the hall, and I noticed that she did not look back, which was the detail I thought about later, when I was lying down on the couch with a piece of toast that Mateo had made me by standing on his step stool and pressing the lever with great ceremony. She did not look back, but she had come. The scent of dark fur and cold iron did not entirely leave the hallway for an hour. Mateo came and sat on the end of the couch by my feet, with the considered air of a co-pilot reviewing a completed mission. He said, "I think I called the right person." I said, "You called the wrong number, love," he said. "I called the number that worked." I did not have an answer for that. The toast was warm and slightly uneven, brown on one side and barely kissed on the other, and it was the best thing I had eaten in longer than I was prepared to calculate. 3 weeks later, I found a job posting. I was not looking for a job. I had my accounts, my contracts, my rotation of work blouses, but the posting appeared in an email from a professional network I had largely forgotten I'd joined, and the subject line was Financial Analysis and Risk Modeling Specialist, Ashcroft Capital Group, and I sat in front of my laptop at 5:45 in the morning, with Mateo's lunch half made beside me, and I read it, and I read it again. And I thought, with the particular clarity that arrives when you have not slept enough but are too tired to maintain your usual defenses, that is my job. Not a job I could do. My job. The precise overlap of the work I had been doing in pieces for 3 years, the pattern recognition, the anomaly hunting, the talent for making large and chaotic numbers tell the truth, assembled into one description that fit the shape of my actual mind. I did not apply. I made Mateo's lunch. I went to the periodontist's office. I entered 8 months of supply invoices into a spreadsheet and found an overcharge of $2,200 that the periodontist had been paying for a vendor contract that had lapsed the previous February, and I noted it in my report. And I went home, and I made dinner, and I put Mateo to bed, and I lay in the dark and thought about the posting. I applied at 11:15 p.m. The interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 9 a.m. The confirmation email came from a name I did not recognize, an executive assistant, formal and exact. No mention of the CEO. No mention of the morning in my kitchen hallway. I put on the second of my 3 work blouses, and I took the train uptown, and I walked into the lobby of the glass tower, and I gave my name at the desk, and I waited. The waiting room on the 27th floor was the kind of room that communicates power through restraint. Nothing soft, nothing warm, surfaces in pale stone and dark wood that absorbed light without returning it. The receptionist, a composed alpha woman who smelled of cedar and professional courtesy, told me Miss Ashcroft's associate would be with me shortly. The associate was a beta man named Callum Drace, and he had the look of someone who had been working for a very demanding person for a very long time and had organized his entire personality around the project of anticipating what that person needed before she asked. He was broad and slightly tired around the eyes, and he shook my hand with the grip of a person evaluating structure and said, "Miss Voss, we've reviewed your application materials." He paused. He said, "I'm going to be honest with you, because Miss Ashcroft prefers her team to be honest and it saves everyone time. Your formal credentials are not what this position typically requires. Your practical track record is extraordinary. We've been watching the Plath accounts for 4 years. The anomaly detection in Q3 last year was..." He paused again, searching for a professional term, and apparently couldn't find one. He said, "It was remarkable." I said, "I found a ghost vendor." He said, "You found a ghost vendor that our own forensic accounting team had missed for 18 months. I said, "It was in the supplier code structure. There was a pattern in the invoice numbering." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, that's what made it remarkable." He walked me through the technical portion. I answered questions about risk weighting and correlation modeling, and the 3 cases in my contract work where I had identified structural financial errors that others had missed, and I answered them in the plain language I used with clients, not the performed language I might have used in a formal interview, because I was too tired for the performance and also because Callum Drace was the kind of person who would notice the difference. After 45 minutes, he said, "Thank you, Ms. Voss. We'll be in touch." I gathered my bag. I stood. The door behind Callum Drace opened. Riven Ashcroft walked in. She was taller than I remembered, or perhaps the room made her taller, the way a room scaled to power scales the people who command it. She wore a dark suit the color of deep water, no jewelry, and she carried nothing in her hands. Her scent arrived before she did, dark fur and cold iron, precise and unmistakable, and something in the base layer of my biology registered it the way you register the exact pitch of a tuning fork struck in a quiet room. She looked at me. She said, "Miss Voss." I said, "Miss Ashcroft." A 3-second pause, during which Callum Drace became very interested in something on his tablet. She said, "How is your son?" I said, "He's well, thank you." She said, "And you?" I said, "I'm well." She said, "You look less like someone who fainted this morning, so that's an improvement." It was, for Riven Ashcroft, apparently a joke. Callum Drace made a sound that was not quite a cough. I said, "I try to set a low benchmark." The air in the room rearranged itself again. She said, "I'll read the assessment. Callum will be in touch by Thursday." I said, "Thank you for your time." She said, "The ghost vendor in the Plath accounts. The invoice numbering pattern. How long did it take you to see it?" I said, "The first time I pulled the data?" "About 40 seconds. I thought I was misreading it. I went back 3 times to be sure." She looked at me for 5 seconds, the same 5 seconds as the hallway. She said, "Thursday. The offer came Wednesday." It was significantly more than the posting had indicated. I read it 3 times, then called my sister, who said, "Obviously you take it," and when I said there might be a conflict of interest given the circumstances of how I came to apply, my sister said, "Sabine, a 7-year-old accidentally called a billionaire and she came to your apartment in 11 minutes. There is no universe in which you don't take the job." I took the job. The first 2 months were the kind of months that reorganize a life. The salary meant Mateo could have hot lunch. The salary meant the seam in the linoleum could be fixed by a proper person with proper tools, rather than by me with a tube of floor adhesive at 10 p.m. On a Sunday, the salary meant that when I checked our account balance at the first of the month, I did not have to do the subtraction with my eyes slightly averted, the way you look away from something that might bite. Riven Ashcroft did not treat me differently from the other analysts. This was both professional and slightly maddening. She moved through the 27th floor like weather, efficient and controlled and carrying a pressure system around her that other people oriented to, without appearing to notice they were doing it. She held her morning brief at 8 sharp. She read everything and forgot nothing. She asked questions that were not requests for information, but for the structure of your thinking. And if your thinking had holes, she found them by standing very still and waiting for you to hear them yourself. I learned her rhythms the way you learn any demanding environment, which is to say by paying close attention and surviving. I also learned that Callum Drace had been her second in command for 12 years, and that the staff called him Cal when she wasn't in the room, and that he had once, this came from the administrative assistant Prita, who had the memory of a court stenographer and the discretion of someone who had learned to deploy it strategically. He had once, at a company function 5 years ago, told a regional director who made an Omega designation joke that he could collect his things in the morning. Just like that. Collect your things in the morning. Prita said. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. He just knew. I said, Miss Ashcroft? Prita said she'd already left the room. She never has to be in the room. I thought about this for longer than was probably proportional. 6 weeks into the job, Riven Ashcroft called me into her office at 4:15 on a Thursday afternoon and told me that the Kelvin Group, a commercial development consortium that Ashcroft Capital held a senior stake in, had a discrepancy in its quarterly revenue reconciliation that 2 senior analysts had been unable to locate for 11 days. She put the file on the desk. She said, I have a board call at 5:30. I looked at the file. I looked at the clock on the wall of her office, which was very clean and very expensive and showed 4:17. I said, that's 73 minutes. She said, yes, I said, and both senior analysts. She said, yes, I opened the file. It took me 51 minutes. The error was in the currency conversion methodology. Someone had applied a rolling 30-day average exchange rate to a fixed price contract denominated in a currency that had moved sharply in the intervening period, and then reconciled the result against a revenue line that had already had. The discrepancy absorbed into a subcategory heading that was 2 levels deep in the chart of accounts and bore a name that sounded like it meant one thing, but in the specific context of the Kelvin Group's internal accounting structure meant something slightly different. I put a single sheet of paper on her desk with the explanation, the location, and the corrected figure at 5:14. She picked it up. She read it. She put it down. She said, the subcategory heading. I said, Kelvin uses it to refer specifically to deferred foreign revenue. The same label appears in 3 of their other filings to mean current domestic revenue. The analysts were looking at the right category and reading the wrong definition. She said, how did you know the Kelvin specific usage? I said, Giorgio Plath, my former restaurant client, he was a Kelvin subcontractor for 2 years. I did his books. The terminology bled over. She looked at me. She said, that's a connection from a restaurant client's subcontractor history to a mid-level line item in a consortium reconciliation. I said, patterns have long tails. Another silence. The longest one. She said, "Thank you, Miss Voss." She picked up her phone and walked to the window to take the board call, and I gathered my notes. And as I reached the door, she said, without turning from the window, "Eat dinner tonight. Don't work through it." I stopped. I said, "I wasn't planning to." She said, "You brought a protein bar to the 7 o'clock briefing this morning. That's planning to work through dinner." I left the office. I ate dinner. It was stupid, the warmth that came with that. I was aware that it was stupid. I was also aware that the warmth was specifically the warmth of being noticed, the small and entirely involuntary flush of being seen accurately by someone who had no obligation to look, and that I had been bankrupt in that particular currency for long enough that the dividend was disproportionate to the deposit. Matteo met Riven Ashcroft for the second time on a Saturday, which was not planned. I had brought him to the office because I needed 2 hours with the Kelvin file, and Matteo's Saturday after-school program had been canceled, and the office on weekends was quiet and had good Wi-Fi and a kitchen where he could have juice and crackers, which remained for him a luxury. He sat in the conference room with his tablet and a drawing pad, and was, by his own standards, invisible. He was working on a drawing when Riven Ashcroft came in. She came in because Callum Drace had texted her that I was in and had a question about the third quarter projection methodology, and she came in the way she always did, without announcement, because she was in her own building and had no practice of announcing herself to spaces she owned. She stopped when she saw Matteo. Matteo looked up from his drawing. He said, "I remember you. You have a fast car." She said, "I remember you. You counted the minutes." He said, 11. "Do you always answer your phone on the second ring?" She said, "When I don't recognize the number, yes." He considered this with the air of a person organizing new information into an existing framework. Then he said, "That's a good rule. Unknown numbers could be important." She said, "That has been my experience." He held up his drawing. It was a bird, done in the direct and unadorned style of a 7-year-old who has decided that anatomical accuracy is less interesting than emotional truth, so the bird had very large eyes and wings that were slightly too long and a general expression of having something to say. He said, "I'm drawing a starling. Do you know starlings?" She said, "I know they're loud." He said, "They're also very smart. They can copy sounds." He paused and added, with the academic thoroughness that appeared to be a constitutional trait, "And they murder each other sometimes, but mostly they're smart." A silence. She said, "Are you drawing this from memory?" He said, "And from a picture." He held up his tablet on which a starling photograph was open. "But I changed the eyes because the real eyes are too small for the picture to be interesting." She said, "The real eyes are insufficient." He said, "Exactly." She sat down at the conference table, 1 seat away from him, not across, 1 seat. She said, "May I see?" He passed her the drawing. She looked at it for a long time, not the polite time of an adult reviewing a child's work, but real time, the kind you spend on things that are actually making you think. She said, "The wings are very long." He said, "Starlings have long wings proportionally, but I made them longer because he's about to fly somewhere important." She said, "Where is he flying?" He said, "I haven't decided yet. That's the part I'm still working on." She handed the drawing back. She said, "Let me know when you decide." He looked at her with his head slightly tilted, the way he looked at things he was categorizing. Then he said, "You could come back, and I'll show you." She said, "I could do that." I was standing in the doorway of the conference room, and I had been there for approximately 3 minutes, and neither of them had noticed, and I was doing something complicated in my chest that required a moment I did not, Take because Riven Ashcroft looked up then and saw me and thee. Particular clarity of her gray eyes in the afternoon light of the conference room did not make the moment any simpler. She said, the projection methodology question. I said, yes, she said. Give me 10 minutes with the file. She stood, and as she passed me in the doorway, close enough that the scent of dark fur and cold iron arrived with the warmth of proximity, she said, very quietly, so that Mateo, already returned to his drawing, did not hear. He's remarkable. I said, I know. She said, that's not an accident. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and she walked down the hall to her office. And I stood in the doorway of the conference room and watched my son give very serious architectural consideration to the question of where his starling was flying. And I felt something shift in my chest, like load-bearing weight redistributing. The sensation of a structure that has been compensating for a long time suddenly being offered a second point of support. I did not trust it yet, but I felt it. The Veld Group arrived in October. They were a private equity consortium, 4 names, and a very expensive letterhead, and they wanted the Kelvin stake. This was not, in itself, unusual. What was unusual was the methodology. They had been, as Callum discovered in the 3rd week of negotiations, building a secondary position in Kelvin's supply chain subsidiaries through a series of shell purchases that, individually, were below the disclosure threshold, and which, assembled, represented a quiet accumulation of leverage that would allow them to force a Kelvin board restructuring and make Ashcroft's senior stake less senior than it currently appeared. I found this in the subsidiary filing cross-references. I found it on a Tuesday at 8:40 p.m. Because I had stayed late to finish the quarterly projection, and I had opened the wrong subsidiary file by accident, the second in a sequence when I meant to open the third, and the filing date on the document I had not meant to open was 2 days after a Veld transaction that should not have been related to it. The pattern was not obvious. It required knowing which transactions to stand next to each other and which filing nomenclature the Kelvin subsidiaries used and the Veld Group's pattern of below-threshold accumulation from 3 previous deals that I had read about in a trade publication 14 months ago in a waiting room while Mateo had a checkup. I sent Callum the summary at 9:12 p.m. He called me at 9:14. He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Run the subsidiary cross-reference." Page 4, the attachment. A pause, a longer pause. He said, "I have to call her." I said, "I know." She called me directly at 9:26. She said, "Walk me through it." I walked her through it. Twice, she asked 4 questions, and the questions were the right questions, the ones that found the 3 places where the chain of evidence was not obvious and needed its reasoning explained. When I explained them, she said nothing. She held the silence with the specific quality of a person whose silence is a form of processing, not of doubt. She said, "How long before they have enough subsidiary position to force the board restructuring?" I said, "If they continue at current acquisition pace, 7 weeks. Maybe 6. She said, "What would you do?" I said, "I'm sorry?" She said, "If you were advising on response, what would you do?" I held the phone. The office was empty around me. The city was 27 floors below and very bright. I said, I would acquire the 2 remaining unaffiliated subsidiaries before they do. Subsidiaries 11 and 14 in the Kelvin chain. Both are small enough that Ashcroft can close within 10 days. That blocks the restructuring path. Then I would use the consolidated position to demand a preferred stake renegotiation with Kelvin directly, from a position of increased control, which gives you leverage on the original deal terms you didn't have before. A silence. She said, that converts their attack into an improvement. I said. It converts their reconnaissance into a map we use better than they intended. Silence, she said. Come in at 7 tomorrow. Don't use the side entrance, use the main lobby. She hung up. I sat in the empty office at 9:31 p.m. and looked at the city, and I thought about the wrong number call, and the seam in the linoleum, and the posting I had almost not applied to, and the pattern that had only been visible because of a restaurant client's subcontractor history and a trade publication in a pediatrician's waiting room, and the way that patterns have long tails. The main lobby entrance at Ashcroft Capital was reserved for executives. I had been using the side entrance for 2 months. In the morning, I used the main lobby, and the security desk said good morning, Miss Voss, and swiped my badge without me presenting it, which meant they had been told to expect me, which meant that someone had called ahead, which meant that the instruction about the lobby had been specific and intentional, and I rode the elevator to the 27th floor with my heart doing something that I decided to categorize as professional pride and would later revise. The Veld Group was neutralized in 9 days. Both subsidiaries closed on schedule. The preferred stake renegotiation opened the following Monday and concluded in 3 weeks with terms that were, by any measure, significantly better than what Ashcroft had entered the year with. Callum sent an email to the full analyst team crediting the outcome to pattern recognition and thorough cross-referential analysis, which was the professional language for what had happened. Riven Ashcroft, on the Thursday after the subsidiary closings, left a single item on my desk before the morning brief. It was a book. A field guide to European starlings, which were not native to this continent, but had been introduced and had, as the dust jacket noted, become one of the most numerous birds in the world through sheer adaptability and flock intelligence. Inside the front cover, in handwriting that was small and very exact, she had written, for a pattern reader and her son, whose starling has somewhere important to be. Nothing else. I sat with it for a long time. That was a Thursday. The following Monday was when the Veld Group's lead partner, a man named Gregor Cass, told a journalist, in a quote that appeared in a financial column on Tuesday morning, that the Kelvin subsidiary acquisition had been opportunistic market capture by a predatory alpha CEO and had been facilitated by a back-channel insider with a personal connection to Ashcroft's office. He named me. He did not say what the personal connection was because he did not know, because the only people who knew were Callum and Prita and Matteo. But he said personal connection in the particular way that phrase is deployed to mean something that sounds like it cannot be professionally substantiated and therefore legally actionable and therefore can simply sit in the air and do its work, which is to make everyone who reads it think they understand something that the article never actually says. The column ran at 6:45 a.m. By 8 o'clock, 3 people in the office had not met my eyes in the elevator. By 9, my work inbox had received a forwarded copy of the article from an address I did not recognize with no text in the body. By 9:15, Miriam Kaite, who was a senior analyst and who had made it clear in the way of people who never make things explicit that she considered my hiring irregular and my results suspicious, stopped in the doorway of the break room while I was making coffee and said, with the smile of someone who has been waiting for a moment and recognizes it, I suppose some people prefer not to compete on actual qualifications. I poured my coffee. I said, that's a reference to the article. She said, I'm just saying what people are wondering. I said, people can wonder what they like. The subsidiary analysis is documented. The filing cross-references are on record. If anyone would like to replicate my methodology and either confirm or dispute the finding, the materials are in the shared drive. She kept the smile. She said, of course. She left. I stood in the break room with my coffee, and I thought, very precisely, about the $2,200 in overpaid vendor invoices, and the ghost vendor in the Plath accounts, and the currency conversion error in the Kelvin reconciliation, and the subsidiary cross-reference that had started with opening the wrong file, and I thought, the work is what it is. The work does not require her to believe in it. Then I thought about Mateo, who would eventually read things on the internet, and the thought landed differently. Riven Ashcroft called me into her office at 10:14. She was standing at the window. The city below was gray and bright, the particular light of an October morning that cannot decide between seasons. She did not turn when I came in. She said, "I've seen the article." I said, "I assumed." She said, "Cass is retaliating for the subsidiary deal. This is standard for him. He has done it before." I said, "I know what he's doing." She turned. She said, "I'm going to release a statement." I said, "I'd rather you didn't." She looked at me. I said, "A statement from you confirms that there is a personal connection worth denying," which makes the story larger, not smaller. The correct response is the documented record. 3 seconds. She said, "Cass isn't interested in the documented record." I said, "His investors are. His board is. If he continues to attribute our performance to personal favoritism, what he's actually claiming is that his own due diligence failed to identify a multi-layered subsidiary risk that a back-channel hire found in one evening. That does not reflect well on him." She looked at me for a long time. She said, "You're making the retaliation into an argument about his competence." I said, "He started that argument." Another silence, the longest one. She said, "You've been thinking about this since 6:45 this morning." I said, "I've been thinking about patterns for a long time." She turned back to the window. I could see her reflection in the glass, the sharp line of her jaw, the particular quality of stillness that she maintained with effort rather than by default, which was something I had come to understand only recently, that the stillness cost her something and that she paid it consistently. She said, "I'm sorry this happened." I said, "It's not your fault." She said, "It is, in the sense that I hired you into a position that exposes you to this." I said, "I applied for the position." She said, "After your son called me by accident." I said, "After the right number worked." She turned. She looked at me across the room, across the pale stone and dark wood and the precise distance of a professional office, and the gray of her eyes had something in it that I could not categorize and had been failing to categorize for weeks, a thing that arrived when she looked at me directly and did not arrive when she looked at other things, a warmth I could not name and could not dismiss. She said, "The documented record." I said, "That's my recommendation." She said, "I'll follow it." She paused. She said, "And Sable." It was the first time she had used my first name. She said, "The starling has somewhere important to be. That's not determined by Gregor Cass." I said nothing. She said, "That's all." I went back to my desk. I sat down. I looked at the file I had been working on before the article, before Miriam Katie's smile, before the forwarded email. I opened it. I read the first page. At 11:40 a.m., a second column appeared from the same journalist with a detailed breakdown of the Kelvin subsidiary acquisition, the methodology of the cross-referential analysis, and a quote from an unnamed board member of the Kelvin Group confirming that the risk identification had been documented, cross-checked, and independently verified before any acquisition action was taken. Gregor Cass did not comment. I had not asked Riven Ashcroft whether she had made a call. I didn't need to. She remembered details. She listened. She had been listening for months. the way the ocean listens to the shore, not passively, but with the full attention of something that is organizing what it receives into something that will eventually move. The second time the Veld group tried was a Tuesday in November, and they did not use a column. I was leaving the building at 7:20 in the evening when a car stopped at the curb and a man I had never seen before got out and told me, in the pleasant voice of someone describing a weather forecast, that I should give a great deal of thought to the kind of work I wanted to do in this city long term, because the city was smaller than it looked from inside Ashcroft's building. And there were a number of very established firms who found that pattern recognition talent was most effective when it was not entangled with a particular employer's personal interests. He put a card in my hand. He said, "Cass is generous to people who think clearly about their options." He got back in the car. I stood on the sidewalk in November at 7:20 p.m. and looked at the card and thought, with the clarity of a person who has been tired for 3 years and has recently begun to remember what the absence of exhaustion feels like, this is a threat. It is dressed as an opportunity. The dressing is thin. The threat is thinner. I photographed the card and sent it to Callum. He sent back 3 words, "Are you safe?" I sent back yes, "Still outside, 1 minute." 1 minute later, Callum came through the main lobby doors. He was wearing his coat and no scarf, and the expression of a man who has done this before. He stood next to me on the sidewalk and looked in the direction the car had gone and did not say anything for approximately 10 seconds. Then he said, "She's going to want to know." I said, "I know." He said, "Will you let her?" I said, "I already told you." He said, "I mean all of it, not just the card." I looked at him. He said, "In 12 years, I have never seen her eat her lunch away from her desk because someone mentioned a place she thought another person might like. I have never seen her look up the field guide range of any bird for any reason whatsoever." He paused. "I have never seen her make a call to a journalist's fact-checker at midnight to ensure that a sourced rebuttal ran the following morning." I said, "She did that herself." He said, "She does everything herself." That's the point. He looked at me with the slightly exhausted patience of a man who has been watching someone he cares about move very slowly towards something important. He said, "She was raised by a man who believed that needing anyone was a strategic liability. Her mother died when she was 11. She has built everything she has on the principle that the only person she can absolutely rely on is herself, and she has been correct about that, and it has cost her everything that isn't this building." He gestured at the glass tower. He said, "You should know that. Before you decide what to tell her." I said, "I was going to tell her everything." He said, "I know. I wanted to make sure you knew what you were walking into." I said, "Callum." He said, "Yes." I said, "Go inside." "You don't have a scarf." He looked at me. Then he made the sound that was not quite a cough. Then he went inside. I followed him. I went to the 27th floor. I knocked on the door of her office, which was lit against the November dark, and she said, "Come in," and I came in and I put the photograph of the card on her desk. She picked it up. She looked at it. She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes," she said. "He approached you directly." I said, "On the sidewalk. He was in a car." She said, "A car you haven't seen before." I said, "No." She put the card down. She put both hands flat on the desk, a gesture I had not seen her make before, a gesture that looked like something being held down. She said, "This escalates because we won." I said, "I know." She said, "It is going to continue to escalate." I said, "Probably." She said, "I am going to handle it." I said, I know you will. She said, you're very calm. I said, I'm not calm, actually. I've spent 3 years being the person who holds things together when the structure is bad. I know how to look calm. It's a different skill. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, what are you actually feeling? It was such an unexpected question. Not because she was incapable of asking it. I had revised that assessment many times, but because she asked it here, in her office, in the lamp-lit dark of a November evening, with the card on the desk between us and the glass tower around us, and everything professional, and everything personal occupying the same space, and no partition between them anymore. I said, I'm frightened for my son. She said, tell me. I said, if this continues to escalate, if the story becomes something that attaches itself to him. He's 7. He doesn't need to know yet what the world does to people it decides to make an example of. I've tried very hard to not let him learn that early. She was very still. She said, he won't learn it. I said, you can't promise that. She said, I'm not promising it abstractly. I'm telling you that I will not let it happen. I looked at her. She said, I should have told you this sooner, which I understand. I am better at structural defense than at saying things in advance of the need. But I am telling you now. Nothing in this situation will touch him. I said, why? She said, because he's remarkable and he hasn't decided yet where the starling is flying, and that should not be foreclosed by Gregor Cass or anyone else. The silence between us was the kind that has mass. I said, Riven. She said, yes. I said, this isn't professional anymore. She said, no. I said, it might not have been for a while. She said, for me, it stopped being professional in a kitchen hallway at 7:15 in the morning. I said, you came in 11 minutes. She said, I was 17 blocks away when the call connected. I drove. I said, you were already in the car. She said, I leave early. I said, not that early. She said, I leave at whatever time is necessary to be where I need to be. I said, that's not a coincidence. She said, no, I held the space that was between us and thought about the cost of the stillness and what Callum had said and the 12 years and the midnight fact-checker call and the field guide and the very specific handwriting inside the cover. I said, I've been bankrupt in a particular currency for a long time. She said, I know. I said, I'm not sure I know how to stop compensating. I've been doing it for so long the compensation feels structural. She said, you don't have to stop all at once. I said, what does that mean for you, practically? She said, practically it means that you tell me when something is too much and I'll pull back. It means I will not require you to be ready faster than you are. It means I have been extraordinarily patient for 4 months with no sign of stopping. It was, again, apparently a joke. The air in the room did the thing it did. I said, I noticed the patience. She said, I thought you might. The distance between us had changed at some point during this conversation without either of us moving. The desk was between us, and then it wasn't, in the way of conversations that have enough gravity to reorder the geometry of a room without any physical thing shifting. She said, I want to be very clear about something. I said, all right. She said, whatever happens next, the terms of your employment are unchanged. The work is the work, and if at any point you decide this is not what you want, you tell me and we step back, and nothing changes professionally. I will not let what I want determine what you do. I said, that's very formal. She said, I'm being precise. I said, I know. It's one of your most legible qualities. She said, legible. I said, you think clarity is a form of respect. You'd rather give someone the exact terms than the comfortable version. A pause. She said, "Yes," I said. "It is a form of respect." She said, "Yes," I said, "and I would like you to stop standing that far away." The 5-second look. Then she crossed the room. She stood close enough that the scent of dark fur and cold iron arrived with warmth, and I could see the line where stillness cost something, the slight tension in her jaw that meant she was holding a great deal very carefully. She said, "Is this all right?" I said, "Yes," she said. "I'm going to take that at its word." I said, "I gave it at its word." She put her hand, very deliberately, against the side of my face, and her thumb moved across my cheekbone once, a gesture so specific and gentle and held in reserve that it landed like a sentence that had been composed over a long period of time and was now finally being said. And I leaned into it, and the compensation stopped feeling structural for the first time in 3 years. She did not kiss me that night. She held the gesture for a long moment, and then she stepped back, and she said, "Go home to him." And I did. The Gregor Cass situation resolved itself in the way that certain situations resolve when the documented record is impeccable and the patience is strategic and the person applying pressure runs out of leverage before the person holding ground runs out of ground. It took 6 weeks. At the end of 6 weeks, the board of the Veld Group issued a quiet internal recommendation that Cass step back from the Kelvin situation. This was reported in the financial press in a paragraph in the 4th section on a Thursday. Callum sent me the link with no text. Miriam Kate did not stop or start anything. She remained the same, which was its own kind of answer, and I did not require her to be different. What changed was smaller and larger than any of that. It changed the way the building felt in the morning. It changed the way the brief ran, something in the air of it now containing the full measure of things between us, acknowledged and clear and not requiring concealment. Which meant that the energy I had been spending on not acknowledging could be spent on other things. It changed Matteo, in the way that things change children when a reliable adult is added to the perimeter of their world and they can feel the perimeter hold differently. He became, if possible, more himself, more precise, more imperious, more interested in the question of where the starling was flying. He decided, in December, that the starling was flying north, because north was where things went when they needed to start over, and he showed the completed drawing to Riven Ashcroft on a Saturday in the Ashcroft Capitol conference room, with the air of an artist presenting a resolved compositional problem. She looked at it for real time. She said, "North," he said. "That's where it's going." He paused. "Also, I added another starling," she said. "Who is the second starling?" He said, "The first starling's person." A pause. She said, "Starlings have people." He said, "In this drawing they do." She said, "And where is the first starling's person flying?" He said, "The same place. That's the point." She looked at him with the quality of attention she brought to patterns, full, organized, receiving. She said, "That's a very good solution." He said, "I know." He handed her the drawing. She said, "May I keep it?" He considered this. He said, "You can borrow it. I might need it back if I decide to do a series." She said, "I'll return it on request." He said, "That's acceptable." She kept the drawing on her desk in the pale stone and dark wood office on the 27th floor, propped against the lamp, 2 birds flying north in the unadorned and magnificent style of a 7-year-old, who knew that anatomical accuracy was less interesting than emotional truth. She kissed me for the first time in January on the roof of the building, where she had taken me to see a city she said she never actually looked at anymore and had decided she wanted to look at with someone who looked at things properly. She said, "I've been waiting to do that since a hallway at 7:15 in the morning." I said, "That's a long time." She said, "I'm patient." I said, "I noticed." She said, "I'm going to continue being patient with whatever pace you need." I said, "I know." She said, "I need to say something and I want to say it clearly." I said, "All right." She said, "I was taught by my father that to want something is to be exposed. That need is a vulnerability that a careful person does not permit. I have run my life on that principle for 27 years, and I have built everything you see from it." She looked at the city, and I am telling you, in full awareness of what I am saying, that I would trade everything I built with that principle for the version of myself that had learned sooner to want things without being afraid of them. You are not a vulnerability. You are. She stopped. She said, "You are what I have been building toward, without knowing I was building toward anything." I said, "That's the most financially inflected declaration I've ever received." She said, "I speak the language I know." I said, "It landed anyway." She said, "Good." I said, "I want to say something back." She said, "Please." I said, "I have been holding things together for so long that I had started to believe that holding things together alone was the only available option. That asking for help was a design flaw I needed to compensate around. And a wrong number called you in on the second ring, and you came in 11 minutes, and you have been here every day since, and I don't know what to do with that except to tell you that I'm done compensating. I'm done pretending the structure is fine when it has a seam that needs fixing. You can stay." A silence. She said, "I was already planning to." She was not a person who kissed lightly in the way of all things she did, with full commitment to what was actually being said, and the city was very bright below us, and the January air smelled of cold and the particular clarity that comes after weeks of pressure when the pressure finally lifts. We got married in April. It was not a large wedding, because neither of us wanted a large wedding, and because Matteo had given his opinion on the subject at considerable length, including a ranking of various ceremony options that he had compiled on his tablet and presented at breakfast one morning with the air of a consultant whose findings were to be treated as binding. His first preference was outdoors, with birds. His second preference was indoors, with very good food. His third preference was any location that included the Starling Field Guide, which he felt should be present as a symbolic artifact. We were outdoors, with the guide on the table, and there were birds, because it was April and they had come back, and Matteo stood between us in the specific green of spring and held both our hands and looked at the sky with the concentrated attention of a person who has been watching for something to arrive and has now seen it and is making sure he has the details right. Callum cried, which he would later deny by calling it a reaction to seasonal allergens. Preeta, who had the discretion of someone who had learned to deploy it strategically, did not cry and also did not release Callum's arm for the duration of the ceremony. Riven's vows were short and exact because she spoke the language she knew. She said, "You found the pattern that everyone else missed. You found it because you have been paying attention your entire life to things that cost you nothing to see and everything to carry. I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure the carrying is shared. I will not be at every crisis in 11 minutes, but I will be there." That is not a promise about speed. It is a promise about direction. My vows were longer because I am a person who has been storing up things to say. I said, I spent 3 years counting the cost of everything and crediting nothing to myself. I entered wrong numbers in my own accounts. You came through the wrong connection, and you have been correcting the ledger ever since, not by telling me what I was worth, but by acting as if it was already known, as if I had always been the kind of person whose rest mattered to the outcome of things. I did not know that was what I needed until you had already given it to me. I am keeping the correction. I am keeping you. Mateo at this point said, in his carrying and impartial voice, that was good. Mom, there was a sound from the assembled 8 people that was either laughter or crying or both, in the way of moments that are too full for a single category. The officiant said the words. I said them back. Riven said them back, with the precision of someone who had been composing them for months, which I knew because she had. I had seen the draft in her handwriting on the inside cover of a notebook she had not intended me to find, and when I had found it, she had taken it back without embarrassment and said, I wanted to be accurate. The claiming came after, in private, as it should. The consent gate asked and answered. The mark given with the care of someone who understood the weight of what they were doing. The bond that snapped into place with the warmth of a door closing on cold weather. And through it I felt her the way she was when no one was watching, which was warmer and more frightened and more full of wanting than the public version, and I held that interior knowledge the way you hold the things you have been trusted with. The morning after, she said, I can feel when you're in the next room. I said, is that strange? She said, it's the least strange thing that has ever happened to me. Gregor Cass, for the record, was removed from the Veld Group board in June following a compliance review that identified 6 instances of below-threshold accumulation in prior deals that had been misclassified in the fund's disclosure filings. The review had been requested by 2 board members after a detailed cross-referential analysis of the Veld portfolio's filing history appeared, unexplained, in their inboxes one morning. I had not sent it. I had also not sent it, which is a different thing. Callum, when I told him, made the sound that was not quite a cough. He said, that's a long tail on a pattern. I said, they usually are. He said, she's going to know it was you. I said, she already does. He said, and? I said, she said the city is smaller than it looks from inside the building. He said, that was her exact phrasing. I said, yes, he said, she's been waiting to use that line for 8 months. I said, she's patient. He said, I've noticed. Miriam Kate, 2 months later, took a position at a competing firm at a title she had been waiting for. She left a plant on my desk with a card that said, for the record, you were right about the Kelvin filing. It was not a warm card. It was an accurate card, which from her was its own form of respect, and I kept it. The periodontist's office, where I had once entered 8 months of invoices for less than our current monthly grocery budget, sent me a Christmas card. I put it on the refrigerator because Mateo likes cards. The seam in the linoleum was fixed in February by a proper person with proper tools, and Riven stood in the kitchen the first morning after and looked at the floor and said, "You've been meaning to do that for a while." I said, "Since Mateo was 4. She said, "I know. You mentioned it once." I said, "You remember that?" She said, "I remember everything you mention." I said, "I know. It's one of your most legible qualities." She looked at me. She said, "I'm going to put coffee on." I said, "I know how to make coffee." She said, "I know you do. Sit down." I sat down. She made coffee. She made it without asking how I took it, because she had learned how I took it 4 months ago and had not needed to ask since, and she put the cup on the table where I was sitting, and then she stood at the counter and drank her own and looked at the floor where the seam had been, and the morning light came through the window at the particular angle of a March morning that has decided to be generous. Mateo came in at 6:53, 7 minutes earlier than usual, in the specific rush of a person who has remembered something important. He said, "The starlings are back." I heard them. She said, "Which direction?" He said, "North side of the building." She said, "They came back to the same place." He said, "They always do. It's called site fidelity, a pause." She said, "I know what it's called." He said, "How do you know that?" She said, "I read the field guide." He said, "The whole thing?" She said, twice. He considered her for a moment with the evaluative precision of a child assembling a final verdict. Then he said, "You're going to be good at this." She said, "I intend to be." He said, "Mom is already good at it." She said, "I know." He said, "So you have a high standard." She said, "I have noticed." He climbed onto his stool and began making his breakfast with the focused ceremony of a person who has a system, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and March light and the particular warmth of a morning that has nothing required of it, and Riven caught my eye across the kitchen the way she caught my eye now, with the full weight of a look that had learned it could land and would be received. The wrong number had known where it was going all along. I was just the last one to read the pattern. What the cold teaches us, in the end, is not endurance. It teaches us what we have been keeping warm without knowing it, what we have been feeding in the dark with nothing but the stubborn and unremarkable insistence on continuing, what has been growing in the invisible interior of us all along, waiting for the right season, the right window, the right second ring. To be seen is not a rescue. It is a recognition. It is someone standing at the correct distance and reading the pattern that was always there and saying, "I see it. I have been looking at it. I am not looking away." The starlings were on the north side of the building, where they had always come back to, sight faithful and loud and utterly certain of their direction, and Mateo finished his breakfast and went to the window to count them, and Riven stood next to him and counted too, and I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee in the March light and watched the two of them look north together, and I thought, there it is. That is the destination the drawing was always going to. That is where we were flying. The end.